Hello, educators. Welcome to the final module in the three-part UDL series, Innovating for Access and Equity. My name is Janelle Mercado, Program Support Specialist for the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project, and I'm presenting on behalf of the SIP team. We are thrilled that you are participating in this web module series. The focus of this final webinar will be on mitigating barriers to access and equity through lesson design. As a friendly reminder, the processing guide and supporting resources that accompany this web module are located on the Padlet, which can be accessed at padlet.com/sip_grant/UDL webinar series, or by using the QR code shown on the screen. Like in previous sessions, we would encourage you to use the processing guide in a way that works best for you. You can print it, write on it, you can type directly on it, you can record your responses elsewhere in a format that is best for you. It's your choice. To recap, in the first module of this series, we discussed celebrating the variability of all learners. We reviewed the UDL framework with learner variability, intersectionality, and the cycle of failure. Then in Module 2, we addressed ways to reference the UDL guidelines to develop expert learners, specifically focusing on the guidelines as a means for removing barriers to learning and developing expert learners. In this session, we will focus on mitigating barriers to access and equity through lesson design. Educators will identify the 4 components of the UDL curriculum design, differentiate between content and method standards for planning, and recognize and address barriers in the planning and learning process. The ultimate goal of this module is to integrate all of the components learned up to this point. Let's start with an analogy. How many are you familiar with Copernicus the astronomer? He is a gentleman who discovered that it wasn't the planets that revolved around the Earth, but it was actually the planets that revolved around the sun. This is known as the Copernican shift. Prior to the Copernican theory, it was believed that the Earth was the center of the universe. Similarly, in curriculum design, prior to UDL, the focus of education was on textbooks and materials. In other words, the curriculum. All students were expected to use the textbooks and materials in the same way, and if they couldn't access them, then it meant something must be wrong with the student. Similar to the Copernican shift, the center of UDL design has shifted from the textbook to the student. The students are the light by which the curriculum revolves, so based on learner variability, curriculum goals, assessments, methods, and materials are designed in a way that removes barriers for students to learn. The student is at the center of this curriculum design. Your processing guide provides space for you to make connections as you reflect on the Copernican shift and UDL curriculum design, or commonly referred to as lesson design. Since we're addressing the development of lessons throughout the remainder of this module, we will refer to lesson design as opposed to curriculum design. UDL provides a blueprint for creating instructional goals, assessments, methods, and materials that work for everyone, not a single one-size-fits-all solution, but rather flexible approaches that can be customized and adjusted for individual needs. As previously mentioned, the focus is on the student at the center of lesson design. Following a very specific sequence or process, the process begins by identifying learner variability, or the diversity of learners. And throughout each step of the process, the focus is placed on removing barriers and mitigating those barriers through the lesson design. The first step is to develop learning goals that are standards aligned and barrier-free. By removing potential barriers within the lesson objective, we can create assessments that are directly connected to what we are teaching and wanting students to learn. From there, we use the UDL guidelines to create barrier-free methods and materials to deliver instruction that are concretely tied to the learning goal and assessments. On your processing guide, there are 4 sections to reflect on the key vocabulary connected to the lesson design process. As we introduce each step of the process, reflect on your key takeaways. Also in your processing guide, there is a key question to consider. Why is the planning process so important? In the UDL lesson design process, identifying learner barriers is necessary throughout each step of the process. We've provided prompts on your processing guide to consider learning barriers based on the students you support. As we design learning goals, assessments, methods, and materials, the focus is to consider on learner variability from the beginning, so you can brainstorm curricular solutions right away. You may want to think about 3 aspects of learning barriers: academic, physical or sensory, or social emotional. To start this process, refer back to module number 1 when we discuss student identities. Then list out the various identities and learner variability amongst your specific students. Go ahead and take some time to list student identities and learner variability now. Then jot down any potential learning barriers that might exist for your students. The next 3 slides list potential barriers and related solutions based on academic, physical or sensory, and social emotional needs. To narrow this activity down a bit, focus on one particular subject, standard, or activity. As we continue through the lesson design process, we would encourage you to continue referencing these same students and note potential barriers to learning along with solutions. When we're looking at solutions, we are looking at it through a pre-planning instructional lens. This slide shows potential academic barriers and possible solutions. This slide demonstrates potential physical barriers that students might experience and possible solutions. And this slide demonstrates the potential social emotional barriers and the possible solutions to those barriers. Step 1 in the UDL lesson design process is to create a clear learning goal or lesson objective that we want all students to work toward and eventually master. We want to ensure that students understand the learning goal. They need to know the goal they are trying to reach in order to plan for how they will meet that goal. When designing the learning goal, we want to ensure it is aligned to the California Common Core State Standards and barrier-free, so that we can become clear on exactly what the options are for providing students access. We also want to separate the goals from the means of achieving them. There are many different ways for students to progress toward reaching a learning goal, and we need to ensure we are providing many ways for students to practice before asking them to produce a product that demonstrates what they've learned. This also means ensuring that the learning goal includes a verb that fosters multiple means of action and expression. When assessing our learning goals or lesson objectives, one of the main components is to include a verb. This is the action, what students will do to show their understanding of the content. To create flexible verbs in learning goals, we first need to understand the 2 types of standards being taught. The first is content standards. An example of a content standard is asking students to explain the function of phrases and clauses in general and their function in specific sentences. This requires students to know something, but it also allows you to differentiate the lesson by offering a wide variety of choices to meet the learning target. The verb isn't specific in this standard, so the process for meeting the goal is flexible. Students can watch videos, listen to lectures, work in groups, read books or articles. The possibilities are endless. Once they have the knowledge, then they can express the function of phrases and clauses in countless ways. They can do this in a PowerPoint presentation, in a children's or comic book, a skit, a Shakespearean sonnet, string of tweets, a rap, an oral presentation. They can create a video. They can complete a traditional worksheet or a writing task. In content standards, the verb is broad. whereas method standards are way more narrow. In this example, students will write arguments to support claims in an analysis of substantive topics or texts, using valid reasoning and relevant and sufficient evidence. This standard is very narrow, so there isn't much freedom. However, the focus can still be placed on the various ways to support students in accessing the curriculum to assist them with the writing task. A writing task like this one could be done by providing students with a writing rubric, then the choice on how they will write. They could use paper pencil, voice to text, type their written arguments. In addition, teacher conferences, guided self-reflections, opportunities for rewrites can also be used to support students through the challenging process of writing. Although method standards are more rigid, it does not mean that we can't represent information in the same specific way either. We can still open up the various ways that we teach students how to reach the method standard, like writing. But when determining the goal in the lesson design process, it is important to start by identifying the type of standard being taught. Take a moment to think about some of the key standards you are familiar with. More specifically, isolate the verb. Is the verb flexible or is it rigid? Some of the flexible verbs that can be used when creating learning goals are to apply, compose, estimate, measure, solve, predict, evaluate, etc. Remember, in content standards, the verb is broad. The method standards are more specific. Be mindful about the ways that the standards can be opened up to make it more flexible for all. For example, this is a first grade math standard. The objective is that students will tell and write time in hours and half hours using analog and digital clocks. First, we need to clarify the skill we need to teach and what we want to assess. In this example, the skill is understanding the concept of time. When we look at the verbs and whether or not they're aligned to the skill we are trying to teach, we find that they don't always connect, or that the verb is not construct relevant to the skill, which we will talk more about as we discuss assessments. In this case, the verbs are to tell and write. This means that the student needs to have skills in written expression and oral language in order to show mastery of the standard. Yet, what are we really trying to measure? What we're really trying to measure is whether or not the student understands the concept of time. There are other ways students can demonstrate this. They could point to the clock, manipulate the clock themselves. They could create their own clock using objects or digitally. By not offering choices, then we could be assessing the students' written and oral language abilities rather than their knowledge of time. We have to be able to analyze the standards and create lesson goals to ensure we are mitigating for barriers by creating clear goals with flexible means. Referencing your processing guide, take time to construct a response to the following. Define content versus method standards. What is an example of each? What is the verb in each standard? What are the advantages or limitations with each standard? We have also created a UDL lesson planning template. It is not a requirement that you use this template, and we have included other templates like it on the Padlet. So you can choose the one that is most suitable for you to reference or use to document the UDL planning process. A copy of the lesson planning template has been included on the last page of your processing guide. The slide shows an image of the front and back of the template. We are going to address each key component of the UDL lesson design process and relate it to the lesson planning template. Let's begin with some practice designing learning objectives or goals. Use the template in your processing guide or any other you choose to plan out the lesson objective or learning goal. If you decide to use a template we have provided, your focus is on the highlighted areas shown on the screen: grade level, Common Core standard, estimated time for the lesson, and the lesson objective or goal. If you'd like, you can focus on a lesson objective or goal you have utilized in the past, one outlined in a curriculum you are currently using, and then UDLize it. Focus on the verb as a starting point and identify potential learning barriers. Step 2. Reference the considerations you already made for your students' learner variability earlier on your processing guide. Further, reflect on your students' identity, diversity, your own implicit bias, and further identify barriers to learning based on the established learning goal. Make any adjustments to the learning goal or note solutions needed to mitigate any of those barriers. While you consider learner variability, let's pause for an equity check. Have you considered all of your students' identities? You'll notice on the lesson planning template, after considerations for learner variability, there is a list of ways to offer multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. Begin to connect to learner variability and consider ways to mitigate for those learning barriers. After you're finished, reflect on whether or not you've considered all of the potential barriers your students might experience. Next, let's plan the assessments to determine students' mastery of the learning goals or standards. And again, what are the potential barriers that are potentially inherent in the assessments? Referencing the California statewide assessments, many educators call to attention that our statewide assessments are not necessarily universally designed, since many of the accommodations offered through the assessments are only allowable for students with 504 plans or IEPs. This is something to think about and plan for when developing assessments through the UDL lesson design process. The focus of assessments are on both formative and summative assessments. It is important to focus on learner progress through formative assessments that allows for redesign of instruction if needed. Waiting for one summative assessment is often too late to remediate instruction for many learners. To that end, while measuring progress, we want to measure both product and process. The product is tied to the lesson objective or learning goal, and the process is the way in which students will reach that goal. This is where we want to offer a variety of choices within using the UDL principles. It's important to support students in self-reflecting and helping them learn the best way to demonstrate their learning. Assessments are flexible, not fixed. They should be construct relevant. In other words, the information or skill being measured has to align with the assessment. And as previously mentioned, the assessment needs to actively involve the learner. We really want students to learn about themselves so they can become the expert learner. Now it's your turn to practice on your lesson planning template. How will students be assessed to determine their level of mastery of the standard? Based on your learners, what are the potential barriers to the assessments and how can you mitigate for them? Remember to reference the learning goal that you created to ensure your assessment aligns to the learning goal. Also, once you've designed your assessments, stop to do an equity pause. Are the assessments accessible and equitable based on all of your students' learning variability? Now that we are clear about the learning goal and assessments for this lesson, let's move on to the methods that will be utilized to teach the lesson. While we are determining the instructional methods, approaches, procedures, and routines, we want to think about the potential barriers. Ask yourself the following question. How can we keep kids motivated to learn? How do we consider different ways for them to comprehend the information? How can we provide students with options and choice to approach the activities or tasks we are asking them to do? How can we use the UDL guidelines to employ a variety of different teaching methods? A few examples of methods often used in addition to the UDL guidelines are advanced and graphic organizers, modeling, think alouds, learning strategies, direct instruction, manipulative or multisensory approaches, cooperative learning, project-based learning, self-monitoring strategies, peer buddies or tutors. When determining the methods, also consider the prerequisite skills students would need in order to be successful within those methods. For example, if we're using cooperative learning, do students know how to work in groups? If we're using project-based learning, do students have the skills to be independent and guide their own learning? If not, what skills do we need to teach in addition to the lesson goal? Using your lesson planning template, the UDL guidelines, and any additional resources from the Padlet, determine which methods will be utilized to teach the lesson. What barriers might students experience, and how can you plan to mitigate those barriers? Don't forget the basics. What is necessary for some is good for all. Offer students voice and choice. Provide students with opportunities to be in the driver's seat of their own learning. When designing the methods section of your lesson plan, consider the opening or anticipatory set to begin the lesson. How will you support students in connecting to their background knowledge? Help them understand why what is going to be taught is relevant and important. Assess the skills they do or don't have that need to be taught. Then, consider how you will model new skills and provide students through guided and independent practice, and how the lesson will close. Don't forget to stop and do an equity pause. Are the methods accessible and equitable for all of our learners based on the learner identities and learner variabilities in the classroom? The last step in the lesson planning process is to determine what materials will be utilized to teach the lesson and what are the potential barriers for students to access those materials. We want to make sure that the materials we select are aligned with the learning goal and are flexible for all of our learners. Consider this quote: "Fixed media of the past, especially print, shaped and even warped our understanding of what is meant to be an effective learner." Essentially, those students who would function well in a printed-based environment were favored. We even called them book smart. Those for whom print presented difficulties, individuals with dyslexia, say, or whose first language was not English, or those who were oriented more toward visual or auditory media, were shut out. Educational materials limited the goals of learning through contingencies and assumptions. It's pretty clear. Fixed materials create inequities. Ensure materials provided to students are engaging. Allow them the opportunity to choose options beyond the teacher and textbook. There are a number of resources on the Padlet to choose from to support your learning about materials that align with the UDL guidelines. For a quick reference, on this slide is a list of a few high-end, low-tech materials, technology, or media to consider for your lesson. Some of the high-tech materials include digital text, multimedia presentations, graphic calculators, virtual manipulatives, or word processing. Some of the low-tech examples are print materials, translators, interview, graph paper, geoboards, role play, notebooks, or response cards, and so many more. What materials will be utilized to teach the lesson, and how will you ensure that all learner barriers have been removed? In your lesson planning template, complete the materials and supplies section. Consider how you can use high-tech and low-tech options to provide choice for all learners. Don't forget to pause and do an equity check. Are the materials in this lesson plan accessible based on all learning needs and learner identities? Will students see themselves in the lesson materials that you have offered? Will they see characters that reflect their experiences, their life, and them? Now that we have mapped out the lesson from beginning to end, we need to go back and consider the prerequisite skills students will need to learn in order to reach the lesson goal. Take into account the routines, academic content knowledge, behavioral, communication, and social emotional rules and expectations required. Front load with executive functioning skills such as planning, organizing, prioritizing, and goal setting at the beginning of the lesson. Notice that prerequisite skills are on the front page of the lesson planning template as a reminder to start here in your teaching. But we included it in the last step of the lesson planning process because you will need to know what and how you are teaching to determine the prerequisite skills needed. Take a moment to list prerequisite skills in your lesson planning template. That concludes the section of completing a UDL lesson planning process. Throughout these web modules, we've referenced a number of resources located on the Padlet. There are two we want to call to your attention. The first is the ELA and Math Common Core Essential Elements and Alternate Achievement Descriptors for students with significant support needs. A common question from teachers we often hear is, how do I support students with significant cognitive disabilities that are many grade levels behind grade level standards? These essential elements and alternate achievement descriptions serve as a resource to help educators align instruction and IEP goals to grade level standards. This resource is loaded with concrete examples of instructional strategies and goal setting based on 4 instructional achievement levels, which describe achievement across 4 different levels. On the slide is a screenshot from the essential elements to show how each essential element is organized. On the left side, the table lists the Common Core grade level standard, then shows the essential element of the standard in the second column, and finally, the instructional achievement level descriptors based on the essential standard in the last column on the right. You will also notice that some of the essential elements have been highlighted. This means that it is a standard assessed on the California Alternate Achievement Assessments. This resource provides general and special educators with a starting point to collaborate on the design of IEP goals and instruction for students with significant support needs in general education. For those that are supporting preschool learning, another valuable resource is the California Preschool Learning Foundations. We color-coded all of the preschool learning foundations in Volume 1 to match the Universal Design for Learning principles of engagement, representation, and action and expression. For example, this is a Reading Preschool Learning Foundation. The UDL version is color-coded, so read familiar books written in the home language or English is highlighted in purple to show that this is an opportunity to provide multiple means of representation. When encouraged by others is highlighted in green to show that this is an opportunity to provide multiple means of engagement. And lastly, in the home language, talk about the books is highlighted in blue to signal multiple means of action and expression. We'd like to close this UDL web module series by leaving you with this quote: "Equity and inclusion is not a moment, it's a movement." It has been an absolute pleasure guiding you through these web modules, and we hope that you've learned about the importance of using a UDL mindset to promote equity and inclusion for every student within the system that you work in and support. Finally, we're going to leave you with this video about what it takes to create a movement. Enjoy!
If you've learned a lot about leadership and making a movement, then let's watch a movement happen start to finish in under 3 minutes and dissect some lessons. First, of course, a leader needs the guts to stand alone and look ridiculous. But what he's doing is so simple, it's almost instructional. This is key. You must be easy to follow. Now here comes the first follower with a crucial role. He publicly shows everyone else how to follow. Notice how the leader embraces him as an equal. So it's not about the leader anymore, it's about them, plural. Notice how he's calling to his friends to join in. So it takes guts to be a first follower. You stand out and you brave ridicule yourself. Being a first follower is an underappreciated form of leadership. The first follower transforms a lone nut into a leader. If the leader is the flint, The first follower is the spark that really makes the fire. Now here's the second follower. This is a turning point. It's proof the first has done well. Now it's not a lone nut, and it's not two nuts. 3 is a crowd, and a crowd is news. A movement must be public. Make sure outsiders see more than just the leader. Everyone needs to see the followers, because new followers emulate followers, not the leader. Now here come 2 more people, then 3 more immediately. Now we've got momentum. This is the tipping point, and now we have a movement. As more people jump in, it's no longer risky. If they were on the fence before, there's no reason not to join in now. They won't stand out, they won't be ridiculed, and they will be part of the in crowd if they hurry. And over the next minute you'll see the rest who prefer to stay part of the crowd, because eventually they'd be ridiculed for not joining. And ladies and gentlemen, that is how a movement is made. So let's recap what we've learned. If you are a version of the shirtless dancing guy, all alone, remember the importance of nurturing your first few followers as equals, making everything clearly about the movement, not you. Be public, be easy to follow. But the biggest lesson here, did you catch it? Leadership is over-glorified. Yes, it started with the shirtless guy, and he'll get all the credit, but you saw what really happened. It was the first follower that transformed a lone nut into a leader. There's no movement without the first follower. See, we're told that we all need to be leaders, but that would be really ineffective. The best way to make a movement, if you really care, is to courageously follow and show others how to follow. When you find a lone nut doing something great, have the guts to be the first person to stand up and join in.
Thank you very much for your time. We would love your feedback. So if you could take a few moments to complete the short survey that we've created for you. You can access the survey by clicking on the link located on the PowerPoint slide or the QR code, or you could type in www.surveymonkey.com/r/25ZXPDL. Have a great day.